This special release podcast episode was originally recorded during the 2022 Beyond Clean Expert Series Conference, the industry's only 100% PowerPoint-free educational event. If you prefer to watch this interview, you can access it and over 200 other CE programs by visiting beyondclean.net. Thanks for listening and keep fighting dirty.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here. Welcome. I'm Brett Norton with Beyond Clean. What a week. We've had quite the event with SPX that kicked off our week starting on Monday all the way through Wednesday and had a great lineup of vendors showcasing products and services that really help elevate and innovate the sterile processing industry. So thank you to all of our partners, and thank you to all of you who joined us and who were with us throughout the week. It was a great week. For those of you who missed that content, it is living live, evergreen on social media. So that content is available on demand available to view on demand, and you can jump on our LinkedIn and Facebook pages, scroll through the feed, and you'll see a number of posts that should help benefit you guys. I wanted to welcome back those of you joining us for another Beyond Clean virtual conference. And I also wanted to extend a warm welcome to those of you joining us for the first time. Sterile processing professionals, welcome. Nursing professionals, welcome. Supply chain professionals, welcome. And welcome to all the other partners out there and our friends in healthcare. Thanks again for joining us. I want to introduce this conference. It is our second annual Beyond Clean Expert Series conference in partnership with Power Supply, which is our sister brand, and that is our supply chain podcast. So thanks, guys, for joining us. We're really excited to have you. This is a PowerPoint-free conference, so lots of great discussions ahead, so we're really looking forward to that. And I think we'll be going down a few rabbit holes as well. So stay tuned for all the sessions today. Got a great round of discussions ahead. Also want to thank First Case for the collaboration in today's event. First Case is our CBRN number provider, so allows us to provide nursing credits, which is amazing. So thank you to First Case. Also want to point out that for those of you looking for your CE credits, those will be available at the end of the conference. So after viewing all of the sessions, you will be able to take a survey, and then you'll be able to access your CE certificate. So make sure to tune in for the entire conference today. The other thing I wanted to point out is what is available in the resource window. We have a link to the Expert Series webpage on our Beyond Clean site, so you can get to know the experts, read a little bit about them, although we will be introducing a good majority of them today. There's also a link to the micro-credential page, so you can register through our website, and also a link to a podcast download anniversary page. There is some detail there on how and where you will find the codes each month for you to access and enter for a 5K giveaway coming up later this summer. So please make sure you jump on that page and read through the details, because there are some things you need to go through in regards to interacting with our webpage, our podcasts, our events. So just make sure you check it out. We will be releasing a code for today's events, during one of today's sessions. So make sure you tune in. I want to now invite all of you to sit back and relax. We're going to get that sterilizer load started, and it's time to get this great event started. Kicking off today's conference is Jeff Wertz. Jeff, I've got to know throughout the past couple of years. He's been with us on the Expert Series as the vendor expert, so I want to make sure that he feels welcome. I know he always does. Jeff is the Chief Commercial Officer at Surgio Health. He has like I said, the Beyond Clean vendor management expert. And so if you haven't seen any of his content, please make sure you tune into our expert series once a month. He's got some great releases, some great information, and it's very intuitive. So make sure you're looking into that. Jeff partners with healthcare systems to design and deliver innovative modern technology and data to improve surgical logistics. Hank Bouch, who I'm sure a lot of you out there know, he is the founder and president of Beyond Clean. So welcome back, Hank. Thanks for joining us. I think we've had some discussions this week. Hank is a well-known industry writer and social media connoisseur on a mission to help equip sterile processing professionals with the skills and knowledge to fight dirty every instrument, every time. The title of today's presentation and discussion with Jeff is Into the Vendor Tray Vortex, going beyond simple answers to vendor management. Are you lost when it comes to tackling loaner and consignment trays in your department? This session will examine current industry trends in vendor management and provide key solutions for improving a department's vendor policy. Discover the actionable steps vendors and hospitals can implement to improve their future working relationships. So without further ado, let's welcome Jeff and Hank.
What's up, Sterile Processing Universe? And what's up, Jeff? How are you? Thanks for coming on the Expert Series Conference again this year.
Thanks, Hank. Great to be here. Thanks, Brett. Thanks for leaving out how much whiskey I owe you.
Yeah, we'll talk about that on the after-hour show after the event. And you got to be a Patreon subscriber. I'm just kidding. That's a total joke about. But for those of y'all who are not familiar with the Expert Series Conference, just as we said in the intro, this is a different conference than you've probably ever been to before. In our industry, we style it very casual and very fun, and most importantly, very engaging. So I want to let everybody know right now who's tuning in live, if you're listening to the podcast, sorry you can't take part of this part, but you can at least enjoy the show. But if you're watching live with us, and any questions you have related to vendor management, throw it in the Q&A box there at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to it throughout the show. You don't have to save your questions until the very end. And that's one of the fun changes that we like to do to these sessions. So, Jeff, to warm me up a little bit here, before we get into the nitty-gritty, I've got a couple of, softballs, pop quizzes, whatever you want to call it. And let's start with a kind of hot topic, and I just want to get, the true story from you. What is the most trays that you've ever brought in for a single patient?
Me personally?
Yeah.
Oh, man. I want to say I was just ortho trauma, so I'd say it was probably in the ballpark of 15 to 20 at most, and those range in a lot of sizes. But I don't think it was ever more than 20. I think those revision like cervical and spine and some of those revision knees and hips that I've seen had a whole lot more than I ever dealt with.
Okay. Well, yeah, but just let me tell you, 15 to 20 is still a massive number, and we'll talk about that a little bit later here. So, number two, and I got three here, just so you know how long we're going to be going on these pop quizzes here. Okay. So question number two.
Do it.
In general, with notable exceptions, who is nicer, orthodox or neurodox?
Man. I haven't worked as much with neuro, so they get the benefit of the doubt on that.
Okay.
I'll just go neuro just because it's kind of shot in the dark. There's no way to win them with that answer. So
I know.
Just go with neuro.
That's why we got the setups here. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That's
great.
That'll get cut, and then now I'm bagging on neurodocs.
Well, I took a look at the attendee list before we started, and I didn't see any orthodox on yet, so I think we may be safe either way. But
There you go.
Thanks for the honesty there, because I have my own opinion, but I'm not the one being interviewed today. So, all right.
I'd be interested. What is your opinion on that?
Well, I love all my orthodox. They've always been a blast to talk to and to serve and to work with. You know, never angry, never frustrated, just a joy and a blessing. And if you believe that, I've got some oceanfront property in Arizona to sell you. Okay.
There you go.
So number 3, what is the dumbest mistake or mistakes that a brand new vendor rep can make in this field?
I mean, touching anything in the LR, pretty much anything blue, I think is oftentimes like that was immediately the first and best advice that I heard of, like, don't touch anything blue, and pretty much just keep your hands to yourself and keep it right and keep it tight in here.
So don't touch the blue.
I think,
we need to give them T-shirts or something.
Yep, exactly. So, I mean, that's about the worst situation you could be in, is if you accidentally contaminate something or brush by something in the table. That's about the worst feeling that you could possibly have.
All right, yeah, that's a good insight for anybody who's listening, or anyone who's listening on the supply side or on sterile processing in the OR. If you ever see a new face, don't assume they know. You know, stop them at the door and be like, "Hey, just FYI, if you're coming in here, you know, don't touch the blue."
Yep.
And I apologize if you already know that, but just in case. So we jumped in this a little bit, and I know in the intro, like, we kind of set the stage for who you are. You are the Beyond Clean vendor management expert, and you're on your 2nd year in that series. But even though we got like a short little bio on all those releases that come out once a month, I would like you to take a couple of moments here and kind of fill in the gaps of your background and what kind of makes you tick, and in particular, why you fell in love with vendor management. Of all the things you could do with your life, why are you spending it trying to solve this problem?
Yeah, I think I think I would actually phrase it as I hated it enough that I want to change it and try to fix it. So that's kind of my approach with it. You know, I was a ortho trauma rep with Stryker for a number of years out around Chicago and Arizona, and really, you know, enjoyed the day-to-day of a lot of what you're doing, but it's so inefficient. There's a lot of breakdowns and miscommunications that occur, and nothing is really clearly documented, and you're playing a whole bunch of politics games, and as a rep, you're going to, you know, many different hospitals and trying to navigate those waters, and it didn't seem like anything was getting very much improved. And so I kind of saw the opportunity of looking at other industries and thinking, you know, the software thing goes a whole lot further and lasts a whole lot longer, and feels like everything still in healthcare is so manual and paper driven, and realistically not a whole lot of information that's being shared on either side, from the manufacturer to me as a rep, or from me as a rep into the hospital. Everything's still so manual, and it's just like, you know, there's probably a lot of opportunity in trying to get into work on that and fix that and create some solutions around that. So that's really why I like this space a whole lot. I think it's honestly one of the biggest opportunities in, you know, maybe not healthcare overall, but certainly when you're looking at the OR and the big profit drivers at most facilities being ortho spine. There's significant opportunity for improvement and just changing how it works, because it's certainly become very cumbersome for most facilities and the manufacturers. So I really feel like we're kind of at a precipice of a whole lot of change here.
Is there anything else about your background, or maybe even just personality, that that makes you good at what you do, or maybe to phrase it a better way, that keeps you in the game? Because I think you're right. Like, lots of people see the challenges and lots of people are frustrated, but there's not that many people out there that are taking this next step and saying, okay, I'm going to dedicate my career to figuring this thing out. What about you, or what about your background kind of put you in that particular role?
Yeah, that's man. We're digging deep here, Hank. I like it.
I'm bringing the philosophy, man. Dr. Phil,
yeah, no kidding,
has met his match this morning.
I have to say, like, one of the pieces that I really liked of doing trauma was the kind of having to come up with solutions and participate in the OR, and kind of thinking ahead and trying out new strategies and planning. And I think that's a lot of where we're at with with what we're providing with what I do on my day to day with Surgio Health on software piece. So coming up with what are the actual workflows that people are going through, how are they interacting, how can we bring new solutions in and kind of create a better system, and working with end users. It really has been a kind of blessing of being able to draw on my personal experience of being a rep, and then spend a whole lot of time on the other side of it, seeing it from the hospital, where I've been kind of in the trenches with SPD, with the clinical staff, and really seeing from everyone's different perspective and trying to draw on all those experiences. So I really appreciate being able to do that, and I like the challenge of coming up with new solutions. And then anytime that we run into new obstacles or issues that somebody would like to overcome and work through, I think I've tried to continue getting better, and I have an awesome team that I work with that's able to kind of break things down pretty efficiently at this point and identify, well, here's where the issue occurs and here's how we can begin resolving it. So I haven't given it that much thought, so that's why I'm rambling at this point.
No, that's good. That's solid. That's I can frame that and I can put it in the hallway. I think that's going to be a powerful commentary. I got a comment here from Juanita Burrell. This is going back to my question on what's the dumbest mistake that a new vendor rep can make. And the answer here from her sounds like she's looking at this from the sterile processing perspective. And she says, bringing in the trays at the last minute is the dumbest mistake that a new vendor rep can make. And I'm going to guess you probably agree that that's probably not a good thing to do if you're the first time at the hospital and this is the first time the team has seen you and you're like, oh, hey, 7 o'clock in the morning and they need this at, 7:30. And by the way, my name is John. Nice to meet you.
Yeah. It's always that's always a great introduction and lead in. Tough to replace that first impression when that happens.
And we're going to talk about that.
That's a tough one.
We're going to talk about the logistics a lot in the rest of this interview, but I want to get in this crossover. As I said, like, you're one of our experts that has been a multi-year expert now, so we've got to hear a lot from you over the last 12 months and now into 2022. And I'm curious, in all those conversations that you've been having through the Beyond Clean platform and then even out in the industry talking direct to sterile processing folks, supply chain, to the vendor side, to the surgical side, and the OR. What are those biggest vendor management conversations that have been coming up across 2021 and now into 2022?
Well, I guess when you say biggest, I guess I look at it from, most like opportunity or biggest changes. So, going with that kind of definition of it, I think probably around just some higher level conversations with more of the hospital leadership, whether it be into the C-suite or supply chain, also through the GPOs, the IDNs, just really starting to recognize that the repless model is not really a attainable goal to work towards, and there needs to be some changes to all this. Please.
What do you mean when you say repless model, just for folks who don't know what that debate is?
That's a great point of clarification. So I was a rep. I started being a rep at around 2011, 2010, 2011, or somewhere around there. And I think about a couple years into it, there was always a discussion of, how you can get the reps out of the OR so that you have a whole lot less to worry about. You're not dealing with all of the last minute trades, all the things that people complain about from the rep perspective. And so a repless model is essentially saying the reps aren't going to be in the hospital, and the hospital is going to manage all those sets and the inventory on their own. And, a few different hospitals throughout the country, and, I'm sure there's still a couple that are doing that, but it was something that was trying to really be initiated and implemented throughout the country. And it kind of has, recently has not been a big topic of conversation around how to get them out of it. It's been, it's kind of transitioned into how do you start working with them a little bit more efficiently. Granted, it's still in the early stages of some of that, but I think it's progress nonetheless of recognizing that it's a necessary function. There is a service that is provided. So I think that we're kind of at that stage where that's the recognition that's required. You have to acknowledge that there is a purpose that's being served. And now at this point, I think the opportunity is, how do you start codifying that or identifying ways to make that more efficient?
I mean, if there's no reps in the operating room, who's going to take the surgeons for golfing trips, right? Or
that's where I always start. Like what's going to end up happening? The whole thing starts falling apart right there.
They're not going to know how to play golf anymore. They're going to have to make their own dinner reservations. I mean, these guys and gals are going to be
right.
At a loss. No,
exactly right.
On a more serious note, how much, if anything, do you think the COVID impact has had on these administrators saying, okay, now we just had a year to a year and a half of not having a lot of reps in the OR, and we saw how that went, and now we're like, maybe that's not a good idea. So we saw it for another reason, on more of kind of the health, shutdown side of things. But do you think that had any impact on the change in the direction of the conversation, or is it just all these other things coming together at the same time?
I think it absolutely had a big impact on just kind of the decentralization of surgeries. So I think, depending on where you're at in the country, how long you were shut down for, how long elective cases were shut down for, and surgeons adapted to that and started doing more procedures in ASCs, places like that. So that means to the rep, even if he wasn't allowed in the room at the time of the procedure, there's still a pretty big function that is happening behind the scenes. And this is kind of where I think there's a gap in understanding of the day-to-day of what a rep is doing, and a lot of it is logistics and moving inventory around and making sure it's available and trying to follow, meet the policy requirements of getting inventory where it needs to be. So having those trays dropped off in time, moving them from one case to the next case. And when you decentralize all those procedures from a hospital where you were doing 7 of them, but now you're doing 2 of them at one ASC that the surgeon works with on Tuesdays, and then he spread them out throughout the week so that he can make sure that he can get them in. Now you have a bigger problem of getting inventory from hospital A to ASC B, over to ASC 3, all sorts of different pieces. So it's kind of created different problems elsewhere that I think that the manufacturers are going to continue having to deal with, and I think that the hospitals are going to be kind of dealing with issues of getting the right inventory in time. I think it's going to probably increase some of the loaners, and I think, and I had an article on that. But I think that's going to be one of the challenges. Is now you have to do more with the same amount of inventory. You have to get it into more places and more often. And I think it's just going to kind of change. I think there was a lot more investment in ASCs from a hospital perspective, being involved with those to make sure that they're not losing out on all that revenue going elsewhere. So I think with them being involved is helpful. So they're looking at new models of ways to approach it.
Now, you're talking about a lot of challenges there, and I want to talk more about those in a second. But let's start with, what are we getting right in the space today? Like you mentioned, like we're finally starting to re-examine the repless model and say, hey, there's probably some holes here. That may not be the silver bullet that's going to solve all the problems. But what else over, especially like 2021 into 2022 again, right now, where do you sense kind of a momentum shift or a tipping point on, okay, everyone's finally starting to get on the right train for these particular topics?
I think, obviously, number one is that whole discussion of, it's a necessary function. That's a big step. I think you're seeing it also in regards to kind of tracking systems and including the vendor component in that space of how do you start documenting that information and keeping track of it. I think that is something that has continued to kind of gain some traction and some recognition that this is necessary. So it may not be that you have it implemented at this time, but I think it's something that has come up a whole lot more and being looked at from the higher levels of hospital systems.
I absolutely agree on the tracking piece. Like we've heard more conversations about tracking loaners in the past 12, 18 months. And, the last 5 years combined, it's just everything is kind of coming to this point now where if you're not doing it, like what you said, if you're not doing it yet, you're at least thinking about it and asking questions and saying, hey, is there a better way than what we're doing now? Or even if you are doing it, can we do it better than whatever this process is? If it's a manual, if it's electronic, different systems.
Yeah, I think it's recognizing there's a pretty big substantial gap or blind spot, especially around those most profitable cases for the hospital, and realistically, there's just no insight to it. So it's how do you start getting some of that insight to get some of the control back, and it's going to be a process to do so because everyone's relied on the reps to this point on that. The pref card says just call Jeff. And that means I have all the tribal knowledge in that. That's a good and challenging situation for me. But that's where it's been for a while. I mean, I got a call a couple weeks ago from a hospital that I was working with in Illinois, and I haven't been in Illinois for 8+ years, asking if I was coming in for a case. And I'm like,
my goodness.
I will not be there. I don't even know who the rep is at this point, and I haven't been with Stryker for a while. But that's what a lot of hospitals are still going off of, is pulling out that Rolodex of cards and trying to find which rep they're supposed to have in there.
Speaking of the critical nature of the rep, because you're right, that tribal knowledge is way underrated, I think, at least from some facilities. Like if you go into some facilities, everybody knows, Jeff is the person to ask. Like, don't ask the operating room, don't ask sterile process, don't ask the surgeon, ask Jeff. He's the one who knows. And it's weird because you're not an employee, but you're the only one on that list who's not being paid directly by the hospital, and yet you're the one that knows the most and almost everything about that combination of trays and instrumentation. So it's a very unhealthy balance on the side of the hospital to put all your eggs in this basket of an asset that you don't control.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. But I bring that up as kind of a segue, not a very good segue, but a segue nonetheless, to another comment that we got in the audience here about the delicate and complex nature of these trays, and in particular, the rep or the process and practice of reps resetting those instruments after the case. So I know this is kind of jumping around in the conversation a little bit, but what are your thoughts on that piece of the puzzle, and how we're viewing changing the process and changing the technology to help us capture more of what we need to capture internally and not be so dependent on the rep? How do we transfer that piece?
Yeah, I think actually, little plug for the articles here that I have an article. I think it's titled like "Let the reps reset trays after the procedures" or something along to that effect. And realistically, this is one of those pieces where it was dependent on the hospital. Personally, as the rep, I always tried to reset at the end of the case, hang around afterwards, and move the instrumentation around so that it was organized. So that I'd always like to have a bucket where I can throw all the used dirty instrumentation into that dirty bucket basin with any of the saline or any of the spray that you guys put on there. And then just organize the rest of my sets so that it's at least kind of compartmentalized, and I'd even try to separate it into another container. That's highly reliant on the facility, though. So are you going to get a different container that you can send it down in? Are you even allowed to touch the stuff afterwards? Because there are many facilities that said you weren't allowed to do anything with it. So in that instance, you're completely reliant on the scrub tech in the room to follow through on what their process is. And those are always variable too. I'm still amazed as to the variation that takes place post-procedure for managing instrumentation of what those policies are, because it's such a big impact to SPD that it still boggles my mind that there's not a consensus on what the expectation should be, because it'd be like one tech would come in that's a traveler and they do it one way, but this hospital does it differently. And it's like, I'd love to just be able to put them all together so that it helps everyone, because then that helps me save time in the long run also. So it's one of those things that I think it's a policy discussion that needs to be had with the clinical teams.
And even if you are, let's say that you're a vendor rep in the OR and you are putting your trays together, you do want to get that kind of education and direction. I think we mentioned this at last year's Expert Series conference on just educating the rep on the clinical part of the process. Like, the trays, the procedure, you don't quite have the full picture oftentimes of what happens when it gets to decontam and what is that process all the way through sterile processing before it's wrapped, it goes back upstairs. And even in the post-operative, like you kind of alluded to pre-treatment, like you want your surgical techs or your nurses in the room saying, hey, if you'll reset it, I'll make sure that all the saline is off and all the pre-treatment is on. And then that piece, we've got some collaborative communication, because you're right. If the roles are not clear on who's doing what, there's all kinds of opportunities for missing instruments or a critical part of the process. And quite frankly, if you look at these accreditation groups like the Joint Commission, like the DNV, and of course Department of Health, you're getting tagged often on the pre-treatment or lack thereof or inconsistency in at that stage in particular. And that's where the rep is again kind of being relied on. But if they don't have that clinical process training and knowledge of the pre-treatment especially, like that's just another opportunity for your hospital to get cited. So we don't want that.
Absolutely.
But yeah, that's a great insight.
Yeah.
So we started, I think, on where do you see the industry getting things right on this topic? And it was, hey, people are starting to ask more questions and push toward this loaner tracking all the way up and down into the C-suite, all the way down to the frontline folks. But where do you see, like, what are the things that should be talked about today in vendor management, but you're still not seeing them rise to the level of importance that they should be, in your opinion?
I think on that side of for opportunities from the hospital perspective is actually the clinical teams and SPD teams working as a team. I think I'm still shocked as to how many facilities that we'll speak with that are on a completely different wavelength than the clinical side of things. So if they want to implement a vendor program, it's like they have to sell it to them, and they haven't even discussed it. And even though they might, somewhat agree, the clinical team is trying to work with the surgeon instead. And I'll tell you, the rep and the surgeon are a team. That was the goal of any rep and the surgeon. The rep is trying to be on the same team as the surgeon. That's their client. They're going to work with the hospital in whatever capacity that their surgeon is going to require. That's their main point person. And anytime that you have SPD and clinical fragmented, you're immediately weaker. So I think, the huge opportunity for any SPD and clinical team, if you have challenging vendors at your facility, is getting on the same page and working as a team, because then you can actually influence the surgeon, and you become a whole lot stronger if you're a united front and on the same page. And I think that there's so much miscommunication and misunderstanding between each of those teams, where there's animosity built up over time, probably with different issues. Them not, clinical teams not understanding what's going on in SPD, and vice versa. So to the point where you're fragmented and you don't have a united front, and the surgeon and the rep immediately have the upper hand, and any policy that you have, I know I can kind of walk over because I have the surgeon behind me, and the clinical team is going to be defer to the surgeon. So there's a lot of political dynamics at play, and I think the easiest first step for most of these facilities is working with the clinical team and being involved and being a part of it, so that everyone's on the same page.
Yeah. And that brings me to a question that we've got here from the audience. Actually, one of our other experts is going to be speaking later today about UDIs. This is one of our power supply experts. And the question from Ashlea is, can you talk about the risk that all this is happening to hospitals because all of the rep turnover that's happening now in the market in particular? So let's use your story, Jeff.
Yeah.
If you're the expert and you got this great relationship with a surgeon that you just mentioned, and you know all this, everything's going smooth, and you turn over, it's a brand new rep who knows how much experience, if any, they have. Where's the risk to the process, and then to the patient, and to just quality and everything else in that? Like, are you kind of seeing that same challenge out there today?
Yeah, no, it's a great one. Shout out Ashlea. So I think just in general, you start kind of to what you were speaking to earlier, Hank. My goal when I was a rep was to be that go-to person that can answer any of the questions at the facility. Anything that's involved with the procedure, I want to know where the retractors are. I want to know where you keep peel packs. I want to know where even my competitors' products are. So in case something crazy happens, I'm a resource and a team member. So, I think a lot of facilities become very reliant on that, and immediately that's a pretty obvious exposure point when I'm not reachable, and I would get calls at night of, where's this and this inventory, because it was the on-call person, and I'm their resource for it when they're covering those cases at times. So there's a lot of risk if I leave and no one knows who to call. I mean, it goes back to that phone call that I got a few weeks ago. That was for a day of case. They're like, are you coming in for this doctor's case this afternoon? And it's like, do they even have the inventory there? There's so many so many different steps along the process because there's not a consistent process that's established that is dependable for the hospital. That you're putting everyone at risk from the SPD of falling behind, not having inventory available to get pushed through in time, to the patient sitting on the table with the right inventory available because there wasn't a knowledge transfer from me as the rep to the new rep to understand, hey, this hospital doesn't have this equipment, so you have to bring in this special tray. And there's every single one of those has a little nuance to it that requires knowledge transfer. And to this point, even from the manufacturer's perspective, there's not a simple way to transfer that knowledge. So it really comes down to, like, that's why I'm doing what I'm doing is the process for, how do we start providing solutions that add value on my day-to-day as a rep so that we can start extracting some of that information and codifying it so that benefits the hospital, the manufacturer, everyone, and helps me run my day-to-day more efficiently.
I know in a couple of sessions we're going to be talking about, we're going to be talking with our Beyond Clean healthcare storage expert. His name's Dustin Patterson, and I'll probably talk about loaner storage in that session as well. But you made me think about something. And just knowing where your competitor's inventory is, I think you said, so you can be a resource if necessary. Like, let's say the striker guy's not there and they need that tray. You're the only one, from Synthes who knows where it is. Like, let's go help a brother out, right? But on the sterile processing side, and even in the OR, the constant struggle is storage space for these, 20, 15, 30, 40 trays that come in. And oftentimes a little competition maybe from the different vendors on who gets the storage space that's there and how you finagle your trays in and other trays out. Like, how can technology and better tracking, better analytics, data help departments make that storage decision better?
Yeah. It's like you said there. So they have to have the data. There has to be some information coming into it. So from my perspective, when I was a rep to get consignment, it was never a scientific process for me. From a discussion with my supply chain, it was kind of squeaky wheel gets the grease. If I have a big surgeon coming in and I bugged my logistics person enough and made a case for it, I could get consignment, and then it was dependent on the manufacturer to kind of keep track if we were actually getting turns or not. But for them to get insight to turns was really challenging. So especially around trauma, where I'm like, hey, it's just like they're on call there. We need to have it available. And then kind of the same deal at the hospital. If I had the surgeon kind of sign off on it, SPD pretty well went with it. So there's just always been this kind of like, hey, we're going to be doing cases. And then it was always a feeling thing of, well, how many are we doing? What's justification? And to this point, there's still not a whole lot of, logic behind it other than, does it feel like we use it a lot? And I think the huge opportunity in that and what we're providing is pushing some of that information up. How often is it being delivered? Is it more than, twice a week? Why are we doing that extra decontamination process and sending it out if it's coming in a day or two later? So little things like that compound over time, that's going to cost a lot, identifying that. And then if you do have consignment, looking at how many turns are actually going through it. I mean, everyone on this call probably knows of a few different sets at their hospital that have been sitting there for 2 years plus because Dr. Jones left 2 years ago and Medtronic rep went with him, completely forgot, and not to pick on Medtronic, it's every single manufacturer. I went with them. I completely forgot my trays at that hospital, and they just sit there. I mean, I would inherit hospitals from different reps, and I'd go show up, and I'd find a distal radius set from 6 years ago, and I'd show up back at the office, and they're like, oh, that's where it went. It's like, no one's keeping track of this stuff. So, like, if you don't keep track of it at your facility, the vendor is not necessarily that inclined to, or maybe doesn't have the tools to do it. So someone's got to start measuring those things.
I know this question is a big range, but you mentioned that distal tray. Like, how much money are we talking about? What's the value of just one of those trays?
I mean, it's a lot. It's a lot. I mean, like a distal radius tray typically has implants inside of it because it's one of those types of trays that has that. I mean, if you add everything up, I remember I had a screw caddy that flipped over in the washer at one point, and I think I had to bill out like something around like $10,000 for that because it was a ton of locking screws and little, small hand locking screws, and it's one of those things. So I mean, those can easily be over $50,000-$60,000 a piece with implants in it, up to even higher. Imagine a spine tray with all pedicle screws and everything in there, and that stuff goes missing. But that's really where I look at on the manufacturer side. There's a ton of opportunity for them to improve on their side to actually manage that inventory, because they just kind of anticipate writing off a lot of that as the cost of doing business, which I think needs to end also.
I'll tell you that that story about the screw caddy just sends a shudder down every sterile processing tech spine.
I know. That's why I threw it out there.
Speaking of money and cost, you wrote in 2021 a release on your expert series about the loaner tray tax, and it got a lot of conversation. And I'm wondering if you could explain that at the outset here, and then tell us why, or why that's not a good idea for your hospital and vendor partnerships.
Yeah. Well, I think it's really dependent on how it's used. So, it's not black and white. Like, what does this actually mean? And, there was a time even when I was starting that the vendors were charging the hospitals to ship those trays in. So you got to look at kind of breaking it down to the fundamentals here. What's the purpose and function of these loaner sets? Is typically it's the surgeon's request that they have these available. So the idea is that from a manufacturer perspective, they're servicing the surgeon's requirements and making those available to them. So a lot of these, especially today, they're not actually profit generating trays. Those are just the tools to implant the device. So when you're looking at this, it costs a lot of money for the manufacturers to move those around. And granted, they do make money when there's an implant on it, but they're having to manage their side of things on logistics. So there's definitely trade-offs with this. So I look at it like, if this is just a tax on, we're going to charge for every single tray that comes in, there's going to be a cost to that for the reps of, like, that's just a lazy approach to it. In my eyes, that's just saying, we're just going to charge because that's an easy opportunity for us to get some money back on the margins here. It's not actually digging into what's the impact of that. So I think if you do that blanket, everything is going to be charged, you're immediately creating a lot of animosity. What are the costs of that? Now one vendor is going to say, no, I'm not going to do that anymore. Are you going to supplant that vendor and move a new one in? All right, well then what are the costs to train up your staff on a new system, new inventory, move all the old stuff out, new stuff in? SPD has to learn all the new trays that are coming in. Surgeon has to adjust. There's a whole lot of meetings, everything. Is it worth that stress on that, or is there a more intelligent way that we can do this, of looking at what is an acceptable amount of loaners that should come in? I think that's where the conversation should start, of how many are coming in the first place. Because my guess in those instances, if they're just doing a blanket tray tax, is that somebody finally started tracking how much it costs to process a tray. So they're just going to start passing that along. And I think that approach, that's the first stab at it, and it begins, raising these questions up, but it's a lazy way to do it.
In politics, they have something called sin tax, and that's like on tobacco and alcohol or gambling. Oftentimes you'll see taxes. What what would you think? I'm kind of asking this, tongue in cheek. This is a long setup here, but what would you think about charging a tax on if the rep pokes a hole in our blue wrap by incorrectly removing it from storage or slamming it down on a cart? That action should not be incentivized or ignored. Is that a reasonable use of a tax? Or are we still going to be in the same position of it's probably not the solution to that problem?
Yeah, I think that one's a tough one, because anything like that, I'm going to look at how are you going to prove that.
Yeah,
like I didn't set it down like that, or you guys stored it, you guys stacked it up on top of the other one, and and then I was in the room and someone sent me out to get it because no one was available to get the tray for the surgeon. A lot of those things are easy escapes, so it's one of those questions of how are you going to actually track it and hold someone accountable to those things. So I think that's where you got to get aligned in what are the fundamentals. What's the end goal here? Like what are you actually trying to accomplish? Because I think a lot of the different policies and discussions that take place around the vendors are treating a symptom rather than the actual disease.
Right. They're trying to respond to that person or the personality that's in front of you and not the process that person is operating under.
Yep.
And even, like the holes and wraps, everybody has a vested interest in that tray staying sterile from the moment of sterilization to the patient. Everybody. Sterile processing doesn't want holes. The rep
one caveat
definitely does not want holes. Okay, go ahead.
The caveat is competitive reps. I mean, I know of stories where competitive reps have gone around and put holes in other trays. So how is that gonna, how are we gonna keep track of something like that? Because now I open up my set, I can't use it. I've had to cover other manufacturers' cases just to make sure my surgeon was covered with a competitive product, and that's about the worst feeling in the world, is just making money for somebody else because they sabotage you.
So let's talk about that, because I don't think that is a topic that is really discussed openly. Like I asked that question earlier, like what's one of the things we need to be talking more about, but we're not. And I'll tell you, as a director of a sterile processing department down in Texas, I had a situation where like everybody, including like multiple competitors and the OR staff, said, yeah, it's probably this rep, because those aren't like little puncture marks like you would get on a shelf. That's like a razor blade across the wrap, and that doesn't just happen. And so it's way more common. I'm not saying it happens all the time at every facility and any time there's competitors don't like it, but it's not like, oh, this is this random story that happened maybe 10 years ago. No, like it happened. So in your experience, like how often did you run into that question, right? Like it's hard to prove because, as you said, you can't always be with your trays 24/7 and know, is this an accidental or is it an intentional? But how many times did you get the feeling like, there's something not right about this situation?
Yeah, I think I didn't run into it that often. There'd be some suspect situations that would arise, but it was never like consistent enough where I was like, oh, it's going to actually accuse somebody of it. But I can easily see how some of the personalities in the space from on the rep side could really boil over pretty rapidly. I mean, it's a ton of competitive people that are working, and there's definitely a clashing and high stakes at play, and it's pretty easy in that space to just bump or nudge a tray across a lot of those wire racks are just built to be able to do that too. So you can just walk by one and press it and press that direction.
Yeah,
So
we got a comment
I don't
here
know how
from,
prevalent it is, but it comes up.
we got a comment from Dinsley Koch on the importance of cameras and how, at least in your primary storage area, that's probably a good idea to have cameras, not just for this topic. Like, we've seen news reports over the last 24 months of like $300,000 worth of colonoscopes just walking out the front door of a hospital here in Pennsylvania. And at random, like, I was consulting in a hospital in New York, and they came by and said, yeah, Hank, we actually found these trays on eBay, and they had our name on them. And we're like, hey, how did that happen? So that process of
Crazy.
hardwiring compliance is critical, But yeah, this sabotage piece is a topic I think that we need to just be more open about. And then to your point, try to build policies and a culture that is completely unacceptable and supportive of trying to prove the case, because it shouldn't be your job as the competitive rep to prove that this other person is poking holes. Like, it should be everybody on the team keeping an eye out and supporting the patient, who is the one it's going to suffer because of that.
Yeah, I think the important piece there is the culture piece. I mean, cameras are easy, should be easy at this point. I mean, you don't have to just get the fake rotating thing that has a little red dot on it that blinks. But actually, I mean, you can get inexpensive cameras that are available. And then ultimately, I think the biggest thing, because it pays off in more ways than one, is just having that culture of that's consistent and high expectations for the vendors, and that's from both clinical and SPD. Again, kind of, I'll keep harping on that.
We are almost at the end of our time. We've got a couple of moments left here, and the hour is always, always flies. I want you to open up your crystal ball, or as Justin said a couple years ago on the podcast, put on your future-looking goggles, I think is what he said. And so put on your future-looking goggles. And tell us, what do you see in the development of these relationships between vendors and hospitals? Like, what's going to change over the next couple of years, and how are we going to measure and know that it's changing the way that we wanted it to, or the way that we expected it to?
Yeah, I think so. Number one to that, that it gets measured is going to be happening, that there's a lot more insight to what's actually going on. I think with those types of insights that you get from beginning to measure it is different opportunities to actually improve upon those things. So whether it be decentralizing the SPD and doing offsite reprocessing and vendors kind of working together on that outsourced reprocessing front, I think that's a really exciting space that we've had some interesting discussions on, that I think could create a really great solution for everyone that's involved in it. So it kind of creates a hub and spoke model for them to be able to more efficiently manage their inventory. But all of that really rests on understanding what the day-to-day at the facilities are, because anytime you take that out of the facility, you're running the risk of making sure that you have everything correct in there. And that means extracting that information from those local reps, working with those surgeons and really getting that information solidly applied, which is going to require software. So I think where a lot of this goes is building out new models where the hospitals and the manufacturers are working closer together and not as just combatants, really. So I think that's where a lot of this has gone to this point. I think like GPO's purpose that was supposed to be to get in there and help improve pricing and manage pricing and contracts. And I think a lot of that is still so super regional and localized still, where it's a really big challenge and they haven't really started innovating on the side of how do we help with logistics and help the manufacturers better partner with the hospitals. So I think as opposed to trying to put penalties and new policies that make it more challenging for the vendors and the manufacturers, I think the big opportunity moving forward in this kind of shift from how do we get them out of here to how do we start working with them is just that of how do we start sharing some more information so that we can all start working more efficiently together and all have a win. So I think that's my optimistic view of it, is that there's a ton of room for improvement. And the more that they begin working together, the safer it becomes for the patient, the more efficient it becomes for the surgeon, and easier it becomes for the hospitals for everyone to work together. But it's going to take some time, and it requires, starting with the basics. Like everything that I look at in healthcare is kind of crawl, walk, run. Everyone has a cell phone at this point where it does everything for you. But anytime you get into the hospital, then we got to immediately stop and pause and reverse 10, 15 years in the past of where we're at, because it's just been such a slow adoption rate and expectations are high, and it's kind of starting from square one and can drive continuous improvement from there.
I think one of the reasons that the cell phones are not as operational in hospitals is because they built those hospitals poorly, not thinking about cell phone reception. Because how many of those are like dungeons? You go in and the cell phone doesn't work.
Absolutely.
So even if you had a mobile app, it ain't working unless you're on the Wi-Fi. But that's a whole other discussion for another time. Terrific session.
You need to get a Wi-Fi expert on here now. If you can get a hospital Wi-Fi person on here, that person is going to be hit up often.
How do we fix the cell phone problem? Yeah, I think everyone has a vested interest in that. All right, Jeff, thank you for your time and for coming on, and for your commitment to educate the whole industry around all of these topics related to vendor management. Keep doing the good work.
Thank you, Hank. Thanks for everything. I appreciate all the work that you guys are doing. So thanks for having me on.
And with that, we'll turn it back over to the host.
Thanks, guys. That was a quick hour. They always seem to just fly by, don't they?
No kidding.
Yeah, great discussion. Really appreciate your insight, Jeff. And I think we might have outlined some more expert submittals for the coming months. So looking forward to some more of your insight throughout the year. So thanks again, and we will see you soon.